On the phone, Ari Paul, a New York City-based journalist whose most recent piece in the Jacobin Smash the Lynch mob, of course, speaks to the labor movement should be rallying against police violence, whether police unions like it or not. Ari, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So, Ari, let's start. First off, there was a report in the New York Times yesterday that the number of arrests, the number of criminal summons, the number of parking tickets and traffic tickets have dropped precipitously year over year. Parking and traffic tickets down by 90%. Summons also down by close to 90%. There were half as many arrests made in the first 7 days of this year as there were, or 6 days of this year as last year. So, it's clear there's a labor action taking place. Is it?
Absolutely.
But let me characterize it for us. It's not how, I guess, let me rephrase that. How much is this about de Blasio's saying that his son had to watch out, or he had to give a speech to his son about watching out for cops, and how much has it to do with the politics of the union and the politics of the city?
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk that this comes back to the statement that Bill de Blasio made about how he warns his biracial son Dante to take special care with the police, and that's been trotted out a lot. But I think there's been a lot of deep-seated tension. From day one, I think Bill de Blasio, during his time both as in city council and as public advocate, had always angered the police unions and police advocates because of, most recently with his with his campaign promise to reform the stop and frisk. He was always aligned with people who were, tended to be critical of the police. People like John Liu, or people like Letitia James, who's now public advocate. So I think there was always some trepidation about him coming in, and there had Leonard Levitt, who writes the column at NYPD Confidential, had noted that the police unions, there had been some mumbling that they were upset over the settlement in the Central Park 5 case, his closest to the Reverend Al Sharpton. So this was all sort of like simmering underneath the surface here, and that when the non-indictment came out and the statement came about what he told his son Dante, that was kind of the moment that everyone grasped on, but it had been brewing for a while.
Explain to us how this concept of and I think people who listen to this program have some basic knowledge of the Central Park 5 case. We had Ken Burns on some time ago to talk about his documentary. It was 5 guys who were basically teenagers at the time. This took place 20 years ago now, I guess it is. And between the 5 of them, they served anywhere from, I think, 7 to 12 years in prison. They were basically coerced into confessing to this crime. It's quite clear they didn't do it now. It's quite clear 10 years ago. And they finally got a settlement from the city. It was $40 million. We're talking about, just to put it in perception, 10% of the parking fees that the city collects in any given year, which is less than, I think, 1/100th of the city budget. Yet the police department harbors a resentment that they got paid out. How does that work? What is going on institutionally with the police?
I think they feel that everything that happened with the Central Park 5 case, or any instances of access that happened, especially during the Giuliani years, in the wake of the 70s and 80s, what's often referred to as the battle days, is that these things happen in a context of them fighting the worst of New York City crime, and that they're being blamed for being aggressive when aggressive measures were needed. For example, you often see in both Bill de Blasio and his police commissioner Bill Bratton said this as recently as yesterday, that they're sticking to the broken windows theory of policing, the idea of policing small crimes before they become big crimes, because this is what transitioned us from the battle days to the glory days less crime and rents going up and more gentrification happening throughout the city. But it's somewhat disingenuous to take those sentiments and put them here. I mean, the Bronx is not burning right now. We don't have massive crime in the streets. And if there was that, there would be a little bit more, I think a lot more, embrace of aggressive police tactics. But we have, rents are going up, cities are, all the boroughs are becoming more gentrified. So I don't think there is the feeling that we need to hold on to this practice that for a lot of people made sense in the 70s and 80s, or in the wake of the 70s and 80s, but doesn't make a lot of sense now.
And so when we talk about, so you had this general animosity towards de Blasio that predated all of what has taken place with Eric Garner and the movements across the country. What else, I guess, in terms of the political dynamics are at play here?
Well, the other thing is that Pat Lynch, the head of the Police Officers Union, the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, is up for election in this spring, and his union is in a very tough spot. Bill de Blasio, when he came into office, last year, he promised to settle all of the outstanding labor contracts that had been not negotiated during the Bloomberg administration. And in that time, he settled just about most of the major contracts with DC 37, the teachers, and it should be noted the superior officers of both the fire departments and the fire department and the police department. So now the PBA is the only union. The only major union, I should say, that is left without a contract. And according to several reports, they're so far apart in their negotiating that they're headed to arbitration, which means that a third-party panel would hand down a decision on what their labor contract could be, and it could be anywhere. It could be the pattern that's been set in the other contracts. It could be below the pattern. And Lynch is obviously very, very tense about that. As well he should be. There's a saying in the labor movement that a president is only as popular as the last contract. So if they're waiting without a contract and a poor contract is handed down, he could be in some trouble. So I think he's trying to be proactive in trying to show that he is out there fighting the forces that are fighting the police department, in part just because of his own political struggle. You,
in your piece, you quoted Brooklyn College sociologist Alex Vitale. I think I'm pronouncing his name right. And his point, I think, really struck me as well, that if Lynch, it's one thing for Lynch to go out and say this, it's another thing for him to think that this is what's going to help him to say this type of the rhetoric that he's been involved with. And because it reflects upon who he thinks is going to be voting for him and what's going to attract him. I mean, this is I guess our version of Steve Scalise saying, like, I'm just like David Duke without the baggage on some level.
Right.
It makes you wonder who his constituents are. And it makes me a lot more nervous about the police department. But does anybody have a sense really of what the dynamic is amongst the police? I mean, because it seems to me that this police force probably on the ground is very different than the one that was around even 22 years ago when they rioted more or less on the Brooklyn Bridge against Dinkins, the Dinkins administration. And, we hear all these reports of people turning their backs, but it's 100 or so, or hundreds versus thousands of police who are at these funerals.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I mean, the fact is that the NYPD is different from what it was 25, 30 years ago. It's much more diverse. There are many more blacks and Latinos, women in the ranks than there were. I mean, we sort of have this collective memory of it being basically Irish people from Staten Island. I mean, that is still a big element of the NYPD, but it has dramatically changed, and that should be appreciated. I do think that the PBA police unions in general, this has been noted by a lot of the black law enforcement advocacy groups, that even though departments like the NYPD have diversified, the police unions as a political force tend to still reflect that kind of, for lack of a better way to put it, kind of an Archie Bunker, get off of my lawn political sentiment that is, I mean, it's still in the city, but it's waning in its influence, especially as the cities gentrify. And, you look at a person like Bill de Blasio, who represents the antithesis of that political tendency, was elected with overwhelming support.
And that, you write, is also enhancing, I guess, the number of people who have sort of jumped into this debate. He's become, well, you write that he's creating a lot of concern on the right in general, and that's why, on some level, this story has become, I mean, obviously it's New York, and it also ties in what was taking place in Ferguson and what was taking place across the country in terms of African-American males in particular getting shot, frankly, by police. But that this aspect of it is taken on a national tenor because de Blasio represents something to the conservative movement that they're concerned about.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I mean, the Eric Garner case is a national, international news story on its own. But I think there was always trepidation on the right about Bill de Blasio's ascendancy. I mean, on the one hand, he's a local figure, but he's the mayor of the largest city in the United States and is thus a national player. And he represents kind of the sort of Elizabeth Warren getting back to economic inequality, to talk of economic inequality, talking about progressive taxation, that this is sort of a return to liberalism's roots, when as opposed to Clinton liberalism or something like that. And so the right had been very tense about him being successful, that if his policies were to work, there would be more people like him in the Democratic Party rising in the ranks. And when he was running, there was always this talk of, well, if you elect Bill de Blasio, liberalism is going to bring in the battle days of the 70s and 80s. So crime is something that the right has always tried to focus on with him, and it's something that Bill de Blasio has always been he's been nervous about. If crime spikes, it's going to hurt him very, very badly, which is why I think he brought someone like Bill Bratton from the Giuliani administration to come and sort of assuage those fears. But that's why you're sort of seeing Rudy Giuliani, the Manhattan Institute, Fox News, the New York Press join forces, ironically, with a powerful public sector union. I mean, it's sort of, you would think that they wouldn't want the power of public sector unions to dictate to hover over City Hall, but that's exactly what they're doing, and that hypocrisy, I think, exposes how desperate they are in this situation. Yeah,
I mean, it's fascinating on both ends of it, isn't it? I mean, on one hand, if de Blasio gets through his term with a continued reduction in crime, or even I guess a plateau in the reduction of crime, all of Giuliani's magic, right? Because we've ended stop and frisk after all these years, more or less, I should say. It's down to about down to 10% of what it was in terms of sheer numbers. And suddenly, America's mayor doesn't look like he was such a magician. Maybe people start paying attention to the lead theory, as it were. But and I want to get to the part about the police unions as a public union, because it seems to me that police unions and to a certain extent firefighter unions as well are always treated differently by the right. I mean, I'm thinking in particular what happened in Wisconsin, but because of that dynamic, because they have to project we're strong on crime, and these are all heroes in uniform.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is that there is a conservative ideology about the role of the state, that it should play this very, very minor role, and that basically the state should just ensure public safety via police and fire departments, and everything else should be left to the market. So it is actually somewhat consistent with their theory of how the state should operate. Privatize everything else, but public safety is the only thing that the state should be in charge of. So there's that, but also it is a little racial. I mean, what they're kind of saying when they say, "Oh, we want to privatize or downsize clerical workers or school lunch workers," that end of the workforce, we're mostly talking about lower income professions that attract many more people of color than, say, the police and fire departments. So they'll never come out and say that, but I think that's an element that should not be ignored.
And so, what do you think happens here? I mean, de Blasio came out with a pretty strong, basically, I don't want to say shaming of those police officers who protested, but it was a pretty strong statement, relatively speaking, I guess. Does that indicate that de Blasio feels like he's on the other side of this?
I don't think he's on the other side. I think he has tremendous leverage now. I think the police union and the actions of them turning their back to the funerals has really left a sour taste in the public's mouth, and I think he knows that. The question is what does he do with that? Bill de Blasio is not characteristically a fighter. He is someone who negotiates. He tries to bring parties together, and he's fairly open about that. So I think this is actually a moment for people who are calling for reform in the police department to really seize the moment. You've seen a lot of protests in the street. With the Black Lives Matters hashtag has generated a lot of attention. But this is sort of the time in which I think they can really push for some sort of change, whether it's a reduction in the police department budget, whether it's a change in tactics, and really, moving away from broken windows policing. And I think they should seize on that time now, especially because it's hot now, but also because the New York City budget negotiations start this spring. It's pretty strategic.
And so this has national relevance, of course, because much of what comes out of New York in terms of policing philosophy or, I guess, practices will spread to the rest of the country.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency among New Yorkers to see themselves at the center of the world, and sometimes that can be a bit of a bad thing. But the truth of the matter is New York City really is watched for these types of things. If New York can lead the way on this, it can happen in Chicago, it can happen in LA and Philly and Ferguson. I mean, the real fact of the matter is we need to be talking about these issues in the places other than the big cities. The big cities tend to catch our attention, but really, unless you were from Missouri, you probably hadn't heard of Ferguson, Missouri until this year, and we need to start talking about that more.
Ari Paul, the piece is in Jacobin, Smash the Lynch Mob. We will link to it at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today.